Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying so late. This is the last session of today, so I thank you for that. My name is Ciro Continisio, and I'm a technical evangelist coming from Brighton in the UK. And today I came here to talk to you about scripting for timeline. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how to do creative stuff when scripting timeline, hopefully something that you haven't thought about. Hopefully I'm going to surprise you. So, what to expect from this talk. I'm going to give a very brief intro to timeline. I assume you have used it already. Then I'm going to jump into the main part of the talk, which is these examples of creative uses of timeline. And then I'm going to give you a few final tips on how to start with scripting the timeline. One little warning, if you have a code allergy, so if you're an artist, if you're a designer, don't worry, you can stay, because there's not going to be much code in this presentation. So, timeline is a feature that was introduced in 2017.1, last year. And it looks a little bit like this. So, it looks very much like Premiere, like After Effects, or Final Cut, all these editing softwares. Unity's timeline, specifically, it has this concept of tracks. So this is a track. And the track has, on the left, a header, the one in light gray, which contains the binding. The binding is the object that the track is going to control. And then on the right, you can have clips. You can have one clip, two clips, as many as you want. You can create them, destroy them, and make them longer and shorter. And when you mash them together, you get the blend. So if the track supports it, you can have blends between clips. And so animation can blend into each other, for example. And with timeline, you can sequence many things. You can sequence animations, of course, sound, video, camera shots with the help of Cinemachine, and also other timelines. So you can put a timeline in a timeline, right? And then you can sequence more stuff when you script it, when you create your own custom clips. So people have been using animation this way, right? Like this is Adam 2, episode 2, made by the director Neil Blomkamp, and he used timeline in a very traditional way. He used it to make a short movie. So as you can see, he's sequencing animation clips, camera shots, there are probably lights in the scene, and he's sequencing all of that, like a movie. But I am a game designer. I was making games before joining Unity. So the question that I had in my mind when I looked at timeline was, is it just a linear sequencing tool, or can I make more with timeline? And so to answer this question, I made a little game. It's an RTS game, so it's a real-time strategy. And it looks like this. So if you just play the game, it looks more or less like this. It's very simple. It's just made as a demo. I made it in a week. So I can have these units, I can select them, I can go in, move them around, and for example, decide to attack these enemies. So they go towards the enemies, they engage in battle, lots of violence, classic video game stuff. And that's it. You can move around and keep attacking enemies. And you see the units have an AI, so their animation is powered by the AI, right? The AI decides how they walk around and plays the correct animation every time. So this is the game. And so with this game, I found out that timeline can do so much more than just linear sequences. And I'm going to show you a few examples of what I thought of doing with timeline. So the first thing I wanted to do was to listen to input. So the timeline listened to an input. In this case, I have my timeline. And the thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read the input from the game controls. So the game controls feed the input into the timeline. And as a result, timeline is going to change its playback. So to show you in Unity, if I enable this timeline, you see it's here. And I created this custom track that I called dialogue track. And so the dialogue track comes with these clips. So if I play this timeline, doing like this, yes. So if I press play, you see this is kind of like a little cutscene. Should have some audio. Yeah, nice. So as you can see, the character speaks, and as soon as the timeline reaches this clip, it stops. And it shows some text on screen, and the text is also contained in the clip. So if I select this clip here, you can see that I can control the text in the UI directly from timeline. So my clips can feed text to the UI. And then if this checkbox is enabled, as you can see, the timeline stops. And then I can press spacebar to resume, and then it stops again, and then I can press spacebar. And so every time I see dialogue, I have time to read the dialogue. The timeline stops, and as I press spacebar, it moves forward. Okay, so I can create like a cutscene that waits for my input as a player. And I can press spacebar again, and the timeline resumes. So here I'm listening for input. It's very simple. It's a very simple use. But the key thing here is having these clips on the timeline means that at any time, I can duplicate one, I can bring it to the beginning, and say, for example, something like this. And if I remove the pause, then the next time I play the cutscene, I will see this text in the UI. So as you can see, the idea is that you can change the order of things very quickly. So once you have this system in place, you can give it to a designer, and they can create endless cutscenes and endless dialogues, controlling the pace, with ease. So this was one example. Let me put back the normal camera. But I'm a game designer, so that was narration, pure narration. But what about nonlinear timelines? So a timeline that doesn't always play from A to B. Let me show you what I mean. So in this other example, I have what I call the storm timeline. If I enable it, and I'm at the beginning, you see I have some units here on the battlefield, and then I have some enemies here at the top. So the timeline looks a little bit like this. You can see that it has a first part, which is this like red line that contains a few camera shots, and that's when there's this storm that's going to start. So the storm starts, rain starts falling, and then the environmental light goes down, and then I see a few lightning strikes. And then in this central part here, there's going to be gameplay again. So if I press play, that's how it looks like. So you see there's a camera shot, focus on these enemies. The rain starts falling. I have some extra sounds as well. And I have these like lightning strikes, you see, hitting the scene here and there. Now the key thing here is I'm in gameplay. So I can move the camera around, I can select units, but the timeline is still playing. And the other important thing to note, look at the playback here. You see how it wraps back? Basically, I created this custom track, which is called Time Machine Track, this one here in purple. And what this Time Machine Tracks allows me to do is I have clips that act as markers. So when the playhead gets here, it verifies a condition. And in this case, the condition is if these two enemies are alive. And if they are alive, it will jump back. So it's kind of like a time machine. So as you can see, the timeline is not linear because it's being played and then it wraps back. It wraps back indefinitely until these two enemies are alive. So if I move in and I engage in battle with them, you will see that when they die, now the playhead is going to be able to move forward. And then I see the end of the storm. Right? So the playback is not linear. So in this case, I can mix like storytelling and gameplay quite seamlessly. And if you see the properties of this clip, of the time machine track, as you can see, the properties look like this. I have the ability to jump to a specific time or to a specific marker, or I can pause the timeline if I want. And then below, I have a condition. So the condition can be always, never, or in this case, I'm asking if this specific group of units, sorry, is alive or not. Okay, so as long as they are alive, the timeline is going to jump back. As soon as they die, the timeline moves on. So you get some logic in the timeline. And again, this is a system, so I can give this to a designer, and then they can create, as many cutscenes as they want and mix them with the gameplay. So in this case, we have a slightly different scenario. We have a timeline, and the timeline is reading info from the game logic. So the game logic is running, the enemies are alive or dead, the timeline reads that info, and then as a result, it produces an animation. So the animation is driven by the game logic. But then I had another idea. I thought, I have an RTS, so I have units that move around with AI. So they are already animated. They have an AI that decides when they're going to play a walking animation, or they stop, or they play a die animation, or an attack animation. So why should I animate them when the AI can do it for me? So in this case, I decided to plug the timeline into the game systems. And of course, the main game system in my game is AI. So as you can see in this scene, I have a few units on the battlefield. I have some monsters here, some good guys, let's say, here. And then I have this group of units here at the bottom, at the back, which is a little boy and then 3 monsters. And so basically, I want to create a cutscene, I want to create an animation, but I'm not going to sequence animations on the timeline. I'm going to let the AI do it for me. And to do that, I created yet another custom track, which you see here, that I called AI command track. And the AI command track in the binding takes a group of units. So these are the units that the track is going to control. And then the clips are these little blue blocks. And if you look at the properties, they're very simple. So one of the main properties is the type of command that I want to give to those units. So the timeline is able to send commands to a unit as if it was the player. The same way as I would click on the battlefield and say, go there, the timeline can say to those units, go there. So in this case, for instance, this first clip is controlling the boy. And if you see, if I select the clip, I even get a nice gizmo in the scene that's telling me where the boy is going to go. So I can say to the boy, you are actually going to go here. And so what happens is this. If I press play, I see an animation, I see a cutscene, but it's completely driven by the AI. You see the boy moves there, and he stops, the monsters reach him, they start fighting, he dies, and then I have cut, and now I'm here with all these units, and they're gonna sprint into the center of the battlefield, you see, and now I have like this big battle happening. But there's more monsters coming from the hills, so the battle goes on, but our heroes are gonna die, basically. And then the camera starts moving back. So here the idea is that to choreograph a battle such as this, I would have had to have on the timeline hundreds of clips, hundreds of walking animation clips, of attack clips, and then I would have to keyframe the movement of each and every single unit, manually. So what happens if tomorrow my creative director says, now you have to actually move the bottle a little bit there, and then I have to change all the keyframes. While with this system, I can just select one of the clips and then move the marker, and I'm done. So as you can see here, I have the boy, the monsters in the beginning, and then I have the defenders, I call them, that sprint forward, and then I have the monsters that come from the hills. So each one of these clips is telling a group of units to move or to attack. The one where they attack looks like this, for instance. You see? I can assign a target, and then they attack the target. So it's very similar to as if I was controlling the units myself. And then the other little thing that I did with this custom track is because the units are using the navmesh agent to move around, but the navmesh agent is not available in edit mode, what I did is if I scrub on the timeline, instead of using the navmesh agent, I just twin the position to the final position. So I'm able to preview what the units will do in edit mode, even if I'm not in play mode. So I can more or less see what the battle is going to be. And this is it for this game. So let's move forward. So these are like 3 examples of how you can harness timeline for doing much more than just playing a sequence from A to B. In this case, in this last case, the timeline is doing, like the parts here are inverted. Here is not the game logic that is telling something to the timeline, but it's the timeline that is controlling the game logic, in this case, the AI. So the timeline controls the AI, and the AI is the one that plays the animation, right? We inverted the parts. So we're leveraging the AI to produce animation for us, but still controlling the flow with the timeline. So that was it for the RTS, and then I had another idea. I said, okay, can I use the timeline in edit mode a little bit more? Can I use it actually as a game design tool? If I have a game that's very linear, that has things that happen in time, always in the same way, can I use the timeline to orchestrate that? And so I made another game, this one specifically for Unite Asia, actually. So this is kind of like a bullet hell shooter, one of those games where you control a spaceship and you have other enemy spaceships coming from the side or the top. And the enemy spaceship, they always do the same patterns. Sorry, they always walk the same paths. And as they do so, they shoot these bullets, and they produce these patterns of bullets. And they always do it in the same way. So I thought, maybe I can do that with timeline. And so to do that, I created another custom track, but I'm going to show you the game first. So this is how the game looks like, more or less. I have this little spaceship. I can move around. It's cute, eh? And you can shoot. So then I can go to the timeline. And for instance, I have this one here. This is empty. So I'm going to create it now. So again, I created a custom track, and I called it Path Walker. So I can add a Path Walker track. And the thing that I did here is that I decided that my enemies can come from 5 different positions. So I use them as lanes, like kind of like lanes. They are here. They're invisible objects. So they're here. They're just 5 invisible objects that act as markers. So I'm going to hide them again. And so the track on the timeline here, it takes an object as a starting point. So I can assign, and I can say, For example, I want this enemy to spawn from the central lane. And then I can create a clip. And each clip is going to be one enemy. So this clip is going to basically tell Unity that an enemy is going to spawn from the central lane. And then in the clip, as you can see here, I have a few properties, and they will define how this enemy walks, how this enemy moves, and how it shoots. So the first one is the path. So if I click here, I'm using an animation curve. And for instance, I can choose this one. And the second one is an enemy definition. Enemy definition is just a simple scriptable object that I made. So if I go in here, into enemies, I have a few enemies that I already made. And I can connect this to the clip. And if you look at the scriptable object, basically it's just defining what prefab am I going to use, and then the speed of this enemy, the energy of this enemy. So it's defining a few properties. So once I connect this to the clip, you can already see that the clip has been drawn into the scene view. And then as I scrub the timeline, I see the enemy. So the enemy is being instantiated by the timeline and then moved around along the path. And so this way, I can quickly say, I don't like this path. Let me go in here and let me change it. And I can redesign the path of this enemy. And if I want, I can scale it on both axes. I can scale it on the Y. You see? So timeline is driving all of this. And then, of course, the enemy needs to shoot. So I also have scriptable objects for defining the bullets. So for instance, here I want to use this one, fast left. And if I look at the scriptable object, again, it's just a few numbers. So this is just a container for data. It just says what's the start time, what's the interval at which the bullets are going to be shot, and then the speed of the bullet and the direction expressed as a vector. So now, if I scrub on the timeline, then the enemy is shooting. And as you can see, I can go back and forth. I can move this in time, and then it happens later. I can unpreview, and as you can see, the enemy is eliminated from the hierarchy. So if I preview, it is, oops, I need to freeze the timeline. But if I preview, you see that the enemy is instantiated here. So the timeline is taking care of instantiating the enemy and the bullets. And when I remove preview, then the enemy is taken care of. But of course, if I press play, I'm able to play. And so the enemy can shoot me. Well, the timeline stopped, but if I make it longer, and I can shoot the enemy if I can manage. Die. No. Okay, never mind. But he dies. So for instance, if it's too hard, I can go into this fast enemy, and I can say that he's slower. And then immediately I will see the changes. So if I play, then he moves slower. And I can kill him. So as you can see, I can test the game in real time. I don't need to go into a file and edit some numbers. I can do it directly on the timeline. And let me put this enemy back to 0.6. So you can do this. You can, of course, have like more tracks, and have an enemy spawn from here. And then if I want this one to move from the first lane, then he appears up here. And if I use the same clip and I change the path like this, for example, then I can copy this clip and paste it and move it here. And if I change the path like this, then now I have two enemies, and they cross each other, and then they are already like creating a pattern of bullets. So you see how fast it is to quickly see changes in the editor, and then you can press play and you can play the game. Yeah, and so you see the advantage of this, and of course I can always preview the curve. There are another couple of nice things, like if I go in here and I choose this curve to be ping pong, then the curve will actually wrap. So you see that now the curve is kind of endless, depending on this curve that I designed here. So there's a few things that you can do. And of course, another advantage is that I can sequence this. So if this timeline is one level, then I can have another level that looks like this, that has many more clips. And so if I enable this one, then I'm able to do something like this. And you can already see like the power of this system. Yeah, it's a bit hard. In this case, some of these enemies, sorry, actually the timeline should start from 0. So yeah, this is the second level, right? So I have different kind of enemies. I can try to avoid their bullets. It's impossible. Yeah. And the cool thing is also that because everything is on a timeline, then, for instance, I want to try this part here at second 10. I can quickly go here on the playable director and say start at 10, which means that when I press play, I start directly from there. Okay, so if I need to make a change, I can quickly jump to that point, test the game, make changes, test again, make changes, and then jump back to the start. So the advantage is that I don't need to play the game from the start every time. And basically, my productivity is much better. And as I said before, if this is level 2, then I can do something like this. I can have a master timeline that contains both levels. And then here I'm able to, let me just put this to 0, just in case. And here I'm able to play both levels back to back. So you see the first timeline that I created before, and as this ends, I have the second one. And possibly I could even like put them one on another, so they start at the same time. So you see the flexibility of this system. Okay? So in this last example, we have a slightly different situation. But again, the timeline is the centerpiece of the action. In this case, the timeline is controlling the game logic entirely. And so as a result, it's not only producing animation, but it's taking care of instantiation of objects. And as a result, it's taking care of all the gameplay. So it's animating objects because it's moving the ships around and the bullets, but it's also taking care of creating them and disposing them when the timeline ends. But another check is that, for instance, if I kill an enemy before the timeline ends, then timeline knows and it checks and it says, okay, he's dead, so I'm not going to move any more bullets from him. So it's kind of like very smart in this sense. So there is a lot of gameplay in the timeline itself. And all of these, the advantage of this thing, in my opinion, is that all of these can happen in edit mode. So you're able to test in edit mode and then press play, and the experience is the same. And this is key when you're doing something custom on the timeline. You want to really see what's happening in edit mode before you press play and try the game. So, to conclude, I've been very brief. If you found this thing interesting, I know that I haven't told you how to do it. So, if you want to start scripting the timeline, one thing you can do is if you go to the asset store, you're going to find this asset, which is called default playables. Has been made by James, who's a guy that works in the Brighton office. And the default playables asset, it contains some default custom tracks that you can look at, and then it has a wizard. So it's a window that you can open, and it allows you to create custom tracks very easily. You provide a name, you provide what you want to animate, and then it creates the scripts for you. And this is a very good resource for starting to script the timeline, because once the wizard has created those custom tracks for you, you can go in and customize them quite easily, and you also understand how they work. And of course, I made all these assets available. So if you want to get the assets, you will find the RTS game on the blog. There's actually an article on the blog about it. You can easily Google Unity blog scripting timeline and you will find it. And the bullet hell shooter, which is new, you can find it on this URL. So both are the complete project with all the code, some comments that you can look into and learn how to script the timeline. So, final considerations. Timeline is a great sequencing tool for making short movies, for making long movies. So sequencing animation, sound, and classic things. But it can also be integrated very well into your gameplay, which for me is like the biggest advantage if you're working in Unity. And it can be used as a design tool, not for every kind of game, but for linear experiences. So a bullet hell shooter or a rhythm game, you can use timeline to design your songs. All the games that have kind of like a linear flow. An automated runner, an endless runner, that can also be done with timeline. If you want, you can sequence the obstacles. So, these are all ideas. And so the sky's the limit. So I'm very curious to see what you can come up with. This is all from me. If you want to script timeline and create some creative stuff, please send it to me on Twitter, or you can also find me on Connect at this URL, connect.unity.com/u/Ciro. This is everything from me. Thank you for attending. So there is one question from Jehong Ryu. And it says, is it possible to assign a callback function to a specific frame? Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that you can assign a function to a clip, and I did that in this example here, for instance. The AI command track, this one here, as soon as you get to the first frame of the clip, there is a callback function. So the clip is going to call a function somewhere in code, and it's going to send the command to the unit. So it is possible to call a function. If the question is, if the function is on a specific frame, then I would say no, and I'll explain you why. And this is a very hard thing to understand when you're working with timeline for the first time. And this is because of this. In normal editing software, like Premiere, for instance, you have a fixed frame rate. So if I say 60 frames per second, I have 60 frames in a second. And Premiere is going to play them all. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, up to the 60th. But Unity doesn't work like that. Unity has a variable frame rate. So as I play the game, the frame rate can be 30, it can be 60, we don't know. And timeline works the same way. So as the playhead moves on the timeline, we don't know which frames is going to hit and which frames is not going to hit. If the frame rate is very bad, timeline might, skip some frames. And that's why when you script timeline, you don't want to reason in terms of frames. You don't want to say, I put my function on frame 21, or I put my function at the second 20. You want to say something like, if we are past frame 21, then I play the function. Okay? That's the idea. You don't want to rely on one single frame, but you want to account for the variable frame rate that it's going to happen inevitably, because you don't know how it's going to play on the user's computer. So you want to script safely, I would say. So you say, for example, what I do here is I say, if the marker is here, then I'm not going to do anything. But as soon as I'm past this point, then I play the function for this specific clip. Okay? And then my code is safe, and it will work in every case. So that's why I'm saying, is it possible to assign a callback function to a specific frame? Yes, not to a specific frame. You assign it to, in a part of the timeline, and then if you're past that point, you trigger the function. If you see my examples, you're going to see that that's what I'm doing all the time. Another question is, can I change the visuals of my custom clips, like default sound clip show sound wave? This is from Jin Hong Jun. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. No, I don't think so. I think the audio track is a bit custom. Is not. It's hard-coded, so you don't have the access to design something on the clip itself. You can do only two things with timeline. You can choose the color of these clips and the color of the track. You see I chose blue here. And the other thing you can do is to play with the names. So for instance, in the time machine track, you see I assigned some names. Because this clip here is a jump to marker, then automatically I assign this little ASCII character that is like an arrow that goes back. So that visually I see that this one that has a circle is a marker, but this one is a jump back. So that's the only thing you can do, name and color. There's another question coming. And if you didn't understand something that I said, please ask, so I can repeat. It's raining forever in my scene. Is it possible to jump to a specific time? Yes. I do it here. So actually, I don't do it here. Here I jump to a marker. But yeah, definitely, you can jump to a time. So you can have any clip send the timeline to a specific time. Actually, I'm doing it here. This is a good question, because in this third timeline that I showed you, so here I have the boy moving, and the enemies follow him. And the problem with this is, because it's powered by the AI, I can't be sure that the boy is dead by the 4th second, for example. It really depends if your game is precise or not, but it might happen that as the timeline is there, the boy is not dead yet. So I can't move on with my timeline. So what I did here, in this timeline, I have a little time machine track trick. I have a very little clip here, which, let me do this. As you can see, it's sending the playback back to the 4th second if the boy is not dead. So this is a jump to time, jump to 4, if the boy is not dead. So if I play this timeline, you will notice that, come on. Yeah, he moves around, and you see, the marker is jumping back. So I make sure that I stay there as long as he's alive, and as soon as he dies, then I can move forward. So I reuse my custom track from the previous example to make sure that the player will see what's happening on screen before moving forward. Okay, if there are no other questions, it's now or never. 3, 2, 1. I guess everybody wants to go home. So, again, thank you for attending this last session. I hope you enjoyed Unite Soul. I did, so I hope you did too. Thanks again.